being virtual is if you have to do your own stretching at the desk, we're moving forward. Majora Carter, you're up first.
Oh.
You said already, land, real estate, economically equitable needs to be a new lens. You are one of our former board members. Kick us off.
All right. Okay. So I'm going to take it to this weird place, but stay with me. So just think about the fact that if we, as companies, right, companies often work to really retain talent. Like if you don't want to be training up your staff so that somebody else can come in and take them away from you. And so companies get that kind of stuff. But imagine if within our own communities, within communities in general, all over the countries, but in particular in low status communities. And by low status communities, I mean the communities where the schools are worse, there's more environmental burdens, air is more polluted, parks and trees are fewer and less well maintained, health statistics are not great, and elected officials, policymakers absolutely acknowledge that these disparities are there during a campaign, but nothing really changes. And by low status communities, I mean the places where inequality is assumed, both inside as well as outside of those communities, whether it's inner cities and reservations, white towns that used to have a lot of manufacturing but don't have much anymore. That's what we consider low status communities. But if we looked at those low status communities, since we're talking about equity, and again, it covers different races, it covers different, different types of communities, urban, rural, suburban, et cetera. But if we looked at low status communities as if they were corporations and made it our business to keep the talent that was born and raised in those communities from leaving, we would have a really different social and economic landscape in American low status communities, and also, quite frankly, a very different way of having conferences like this. But instead, we actually have a failure retention model. And I think the well-intentioned efforts of activists, service providers, philanthropy, government, even good people that like on this call right now, we participate, in actually making those communities repel the talent that's in it. Because when we surveyed, people in their 20s and 30s here in the South Bronx, where I'm at right now, who believe that they're going to be successful after college, and we ask them what the community needs right now, they'll say things like, oh, well, it needs more community centers, it needs more health clinics, it needs more programs, affordable housing, even homeless shelters. And when we ask them if they're going to use their future success to seek out a neighborhood with more of these things, they recoil. They would totally recoil. They're like, why would I do that? They want to live in places where they've never heard of community centers, at least not the time that are here, or youth programs, as those are the only things that are developed in their community that's good for them. Those things are regarded as markers of poverty. The subsidized affordable housing, that often goes in our communities where there's not a real emphasis on home ownership or land, whether, I don't care if it's regular home ownership or some kind of cooperative model, there's really not a whole lot of that happening. What the traditional way that affordable housing does, and I don't care how good or sustainably it's done, it's a real lucrative gig for developers, but it also entrenches a very transient and landless class of people in low status communities. And that's essentially the same as the equivalent of low hourly wage workers, in our community as a corporation model. But imagine if we made investments in the future wealth generating capacity, such as housing and business development that addresses aspirations for their lives, complete with lifestyle infrastructure, nice bars, cafes, restaurants, as well as home ownership and local business developments that supports people who need them. Those things are like stock options to those hourly wage earners in our community as corporation model. Company success equals individual success. But currently, individual success kind of leaves as soon as possible for the most part, which sort of and then it's supported by activists, service providers, philanthropy, government, and everybody else. And when those communities lose that talent, they lose day-to-day consumer spending that allows businesses to grow, in particular, ones that are owned by people in those communities. They lose everyday examples of success, which makes it harder to reach and teach the next generation. and they lose reinvestment capital in the family home that their parents could buy back when property values were cheaper. And when they fail to sell, and when they sell it because they think there's no real value in their community, so when a predatory speculator comes to them and says, I'll buy that thing off, take that off your hands, they're kind of like, oh, cool, like, I can't believe you want this dump, versus, wait a second, this could be the beginning, of creating more wealth generational wealth for my own family. And we've also, because it eliminates any hope for passing that wealth down, to their families. But it is also, I think we've also noticed that within the nonprofit industrial complex in particular, and I think it just goes into like every other part, of the design and construction government world, there's almost a distasteful attitude about people in low status communities creating and retaining wealth, almost as if it's not authentic. They're somehow not authentic. Why is it that we equate poverty with authenticity in low status communities and design to that level and not much more? And it's the same, I think, across for all colors of people. But what we've done is we saw, the problem of status quo development, and as a part of my consulting practice, and I try not to presume much, but we launch ideas in context, and we want to broaden the idea of who should and do design and development and expand an approach that creates reasons for emotional as well as economic wealth creation in low status communities. That's designed to retain talent, not to repel it, and so that the people in those communities can be the key to their own economic recovery, doing it in partnership with government, philanthropy, design professionals, the whole shebang, but really like not assuming that those people are somehow problems to be solved. Thank you.
You did it. You did it. That was 6 minutes. I do want to say, when we're thinking about this, Majora, I know you've not only seen it done because you talked about the vision, but can you give us some examples of who's doing this well?
Oh, okay. We talked about Philly, or someone talked about Philly before. Miss Sheffield, they're one of my new heroes, or there's actually quite a few in Philadelphia right now. They're a gentleman named Ken Weinstein, who started a project called Philly Jumpstart, or Jumpstart Philly and Jumpstart Germantown. And he was a real estate developer, white guy from who lived in Philly for a really long time. He ended up, and he was a real estate developer. And he did commercial development. He kept getting contacted by, these young Black folks from Philly who were like, we want to do what you do. And Ken's a pretty nice guy and was just like, okay, I'll talk to you. I'll give you the quick and dirty. And what he did was realize, look, he gave him the idea of how to do real estate development really quickly, and they were able to go out and do some of it on their own. And then he kept getting approached, to the point where he couldn't get anything done because there were so many people, because they heard, wait, there's this white guy who's sharing his wisdom with us, because that didn't happen very often. And so he realized he had to start, essentially like a program, to teach the basics of real estate development. And then he realized, wait a second, he's realizing that people are getting turned down for loans. So he actually started a fund and literally gave many of the people who went through this program, because they had to prove that they were committed and actually had a decent deal, and then he would give them their first loan to develop a property in Philadelphia. And millions and millions of dollars. I mean, he literally put in $5 million of his own money in a revolving loan fund so that could happen. And that's the kind of thing that I realize often doesn't happen. Fortunately, there are some pieces around the country where folks are looking at that model. And I know we're trying to figure out, how do we find, capital to help make that happen as well in places that we're working. But that was him putting his money where his mouth was, his intel, and literally handing it over. And because, this was a man who did commercial development, and many of the people that came to him wanted to do residential, he looked and saw easily the very symbiotic relationship that would be good for him as well as good for them. And that is something where I feel it wasn't there, the decision for him to do that, it wasn't motivated in this idea. It's I'm here to help save people, because that doesn't work very well, obviously. But it was really about how can we create real structures that are going to create a better Philly for all of us, and also make it so that you guys are doing well and I'm doing well. And I think we don't see enough of that kind of attitude playing around, in our in many of the circles that we're talking in. And it's almost kind of like, no, we have to, do some kind of project that looks really similar to what we did before. And, we know, and then we wonder why things don't really change. That I think is one of the best models, was one of the reasons why I was so excited by this East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, because it seems like it's sort of on the same line. It's like really looking at how do you do development in a way that comes back to the communities that are trying to actually create a better quality of life for themselves, economically in particular. And it does, I want to talk about money a lot. I think it's because I have to. It's like I was bored really poor and realized that economically disempowered people get pushed around. If you have a visceral reaction to people being pushed around so much, let's figure out ways to put them in positions so they can help take care of themselves. And it also makes your life easier too. It's like, why would you want to have partners that are so needy all the time? I mean, that just sounds boring, and it's not fun, and it doesn't make anybody feel good. So let's try to use our talents with love and intention, and help people, through the process of actually having a better quality of life.
Thank you very much for that closing statement. We will definitely recircle with all of these great questions in the chat, but I'm transitioning quickly so we can get through to the Q&A. I couldn't resist asking that question. Nori, before this pandemic shifted all of us to virtually in-house, Mahesh and I had the chance to do a town hall road show through, I call it Eco Heaven, You're Part of the World. Give us a framework beyond what you all talked about yesterday of what you think the future is like and where you see the council having to focus in on.
Yes, I'm not sure if my slides are available. Okay, great. So thank you again to the USGBC for putting together this summit and including King County and myself and my colleagues as part of this discussion and dialogue. I think it's incredibly important that the USGBC integrate equity and social justice in the certification process. So I'm really excited of all the great ideas that were discussed yesterday and today, and really looking forward to how that's getting integrated in the certification and how we're going to move forward. So just a little bit about what we're doing at King County, just as additional ideas. At King County, our green building policies are inclusive of equity and social justice. So we have this ordinance that indicates that we are supposed to be integrating equity and social justice in all of our lines of business. So you can see our mission here, the condition in which people live, work, and play are determinants of equity. Equal opportunity in these areas is necessary for all people to thrive and achieve their full potential regardless of race, income, and language spoken. And we're leading with race in our county because we do have distinct discrepancies and inequities in our region. And so we're intentionally trying to do these institutional changes to correct our mistakes. And so these are just a couple of these equity determinants that we strive to achieve and impact: healthy built and natural environments, access to safe and efficient transportation, strong, vibrant neighborhoods, family wage jobs, and job training. So at King County, we feel our capital projects have a distinct way and a direct way to impact these determinants. And so looking at our, oops, I don't have control of the slides. There we go. Looking at our portfolio, we have a green building policy that requires LEED Platinum for all of our new construction projects that are eligible for LEED certification. If they're not using LEED certification, they're using our Sustainable Infrastructure Scorecard, and that scorecard includes these equity and social justice credits. Richard Gelb and I talked about the first four yesterday. I would be, remiss to not also mention my colleague Patty Southard, who passed away last year, but a staunch supporter of the USGBC, really a true leader in pushing green building. Her, Richard, myself, Deshaun Quinn, and a lot of people at the county developed these efforts to integrate in our capital projects to ensure that we're trying to meet these determinants of equity. And so the latter half of these credits in relationship to site design and construct to counter known disparities mirrors the comment earlier in terms of we can have really good discussions, we can have really good dialogue and outreach, but if that is not being impacted in our design and our final product, then we're really not crossing that finish line. So we're purposely saying, you know, what are you doing to integrate that that information and that feedback and that need from the community into our projects? And then not only that, it just doesn't have to be in design, really to cross that finish mark. Are you actually getting it into the project? So we recognize that that's another step. If it's not actually in the construction when we're cutting that ribbon, we really haven't paid the respect to the hard work and the time people have taken to comment and work with us as part of the development process of our project. And then next is advanced economic justice. This is a recurring theme that we heard yesterday and today. This is the meat of capital projects. At the county, our portfolio is about 450 projects. That is in total about $3.4 billion. So if you can imagine, my interest is, you know, who has access to that capital funds? Who's getting the contracts for these projects? Who has the training opportunities? How are we providing professional development opportunities in our community? Who has access to the jobs and who has access to that capital? And so it's really important to figure out, you know, how is that equitably distributed and how is that equitably accessible? And then we also have an issue about pro-equity sourcing, and this is related to sustainable materials because, you know, us as an agency, we can move the market. Where these materials are being sourced are in our frontline communities. Those manufacturing companies are in their neighborhoods. If we're pushing the envelope in terms of asking for better manufacturing policies, better ingredient policies, both for our community and for our neighborhoods, there's going to be better health qualities for our residents. And then we kind of make sure that we haven't captured everything, so we left room for people to be innovative, to recognize their leadership and thinking out of the box, being that firecracker in the project and figuring out how to do equity even better. And so recognizing that as part of another opportunity. So I say all of this because these credits make up a third of our scorecard. And so we're really trying to get to that triple bottom line, where a third of our credits are related to equity and social justice, not just the environment and not just about the financial payback. It's really how are we advancing pro-equity choices in relationship to our capital projects. And so again, going back to kind of the opportunity here, I think it's really exciting in terms of utilizing what we have at our fingertips to figure out how to advance equity and social justice. We promote green building certifications in King County. We track that as performance measures. Thank you to the USGBC for always sending us information about those certified projects, LEED certified projects in our region. In 2019, 47 projects were LEED certified. And so if, I'm getting goosebumps now, the opportunity for us to leverage these LEED projects to advance all of the great ideas that we heard yesterday and today, the ripple effect is limitless. What we are able to do to really, get to the wealth equity that we're all talking about, this is the time to do it. And I think harnessing that opportunity to maximize, all the nexus that we're interested in, climate change, economic development, green building, sustainable development, they all touch one another. And who has access to that and who has benefits to that, I think we can contribute to fostering that opportunity so everyone has access to that. So my challenge or my interest would be, how does the USGBC formalize like everything that was discussed yesterday and today into the certification process so that folks in the field doing this work can also utilize these tools to push equity and social justice, not just in the United States, but then in other countries around the globe, since LEAD is worldwide. There are equity issues in every country, and I think they can apply their priorities as well. So I think this is a huge opportunity, and thank the USGBC for really stepping up and providing this platform and opportunity to change our building environment.
Thank you, Nori. I know our Social Equity Working Group is taking note of your challenge. In your last 40 seconds, how are you getting this out to other cities? We're talking about scale and figuring out what do we couple together, but you've got some good tools and opportunities really quickly. How are we getting this out beyond Pacific Northwest?
Well, thanks to you for providing this platform. You allow us to share it with other jurisdictions. We're doing the same next week in the Women in Green event. The AIA is also sharing this information. I just did a training with them earlier this week to talk about this same kind of framework. So other jurisdictions are learning about this. Other cities that hear about this are contacting us. So, we're a public agency. We don't have any copyright on this. It's free. Everyone can use it. You can take our logo off and slap yours on it. So, feel free. And all the conferences that we're involved in, we're sharing it freely. Thanks to the NAACP as well for recognizing our work, and Mandy's been sharing it with folks as well. So, we're King County, and in Washington, we're trying to do our bit of the work. So sometimes, we're always feeling we're not doing enough, and so we're trying to catch up with other people. But then at the same time, I think a lot of people are appreciating the work that we're doing. And so if this is helpful to people, by all means, we hope this is a bit of encouragement that if you don't want to reinvent the wheel, you don't have to, but certainly cater it to what your needs are. But yeah, we have a privilege here, and in COVID right now, it is a privilege to still have a job right now, and I take that very seriously. It's a privilege that we all still have jobs, and we have the privilege of being able to telecommute. I work in the solid waste division, and my colleagues are still on the front line serving the public, and so it is a challenging time right now. So I hope everyone's safe out there. Sorry.
No, Nori, this is the spirit of the values of the things that we need to be considering, and our influence and who's up front taking the hits. So I do want to say thank you for sure. And you've got a good partner who's coming up next. You've been working with AIA. I really want to bring Antoine Bryant next from NOMA forward. And Nori, I know we will continue to talk about this building scale and the breakout sessions next. Thank you. Antoine, take it away.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm glad to be here. Nori, much love. I feel you. Trust me, I do. And so we're all working through this together. So we're here for you. But much props to you and all the work you're doing over there in King County. My name is Antoine Bryant. I am the Director of Strategic Partnerships for the National Organization of Minority Architects, as well as serving in Moody Nolan, the Houston office of Moody Nolan. We are the largest African-American owned architecture firm in the country, with 12 studios headquartered in Columbus, Ohio. But I've been here in Houston now been living in Houston now for 17 years, so very excited about that. Going to talk a little bit more about diverse city, right? A little play on words, but also how we're going to help change the world that we all live in, and we're going to be as disruptive as possible. Many of us in architecture are familiar with these huge edifices, these huge buildings. Our cities are built this way and that way. However, we feel it is time for that oft-used term that we've heard too much in the last 3 years of disruption. We're going to burn it all the way down. One of the things we're looking at, we look at Detroit from 1949 and how it's changed to 2003, one of the most historic cities in this country, and arguably led by African-American leadership and ownership, has changed dramatically. This bottom slide shows you what happens in 2003, and if you've been here recently, not enough has changed when it comes to community development and community empowerment in the city of Detroit. But as we discussed earlier today and yesterday, this was not by happenstance. In the phenomenal book, Color of Law, that many of you have read. If you have not read, you need to go get one. It talks about the disinvestment, which limited access to capital, to education, to quality, foods, and healthcare. And this was all by design. It did not happen by happenstance. It's something that was, took some time, but it was all very, very intentional. And so one of the things we looked at, people often ask, how can I help? And I think one of the first things you have to acknowledge and recognize and own is that we have created a caste system in this country where African Americans have been exploited and geographically separate by racially explicit government policies. Although most of these policies are off the books, they have never been remedied, and their effects endure in 2020 and beyond. So as our cities are growing, as our cities are getting bigger and bigger, they're also densifying. We're seeing that density is happening not only in America, but all across the world. And that's something that we can play a definitive role in as designers, as planners, as activists. We also see that diversity is happening in our country. Many have been told that we're discarding the term minority because we're quickly becoming the majority in this country. And we don't want to be just a majority, not only in number, but also in power, both in our communities and outside. So oftentimes we hear the scary term of equity. How do we introduce equity and not be challenging? How do we introduce equity and not feel as if you're taking away something? Well, there have been empirical studies that show that diversity and inclusion helps to drive innovation. We know that teams make a bigger difference than individuals, but diverse teams are stronger. There are studies that have shown that diverse teams perform better on logical and creative tasks. But even more than that, inclusion matters. For without an environment where all team members can contribute their best, the diversity is irrelevant in and of itself. So, as we move forward with that ethos, we're looking at the fact that there's the diversity of diversity. It's not just by ethnics, but it's also by age, skills, culture, ethnicity, gender, physical ability, and your network and resources. So oftentimes it has been blurred that diversity just means, oh, we got a black person on the board, it's diverse. Oh, we've got someone with a physical challenge, we're diverse. Well, yeah, no, it's a bit more multifaceted than that because we want to ensure that all voices are heard and all voices have a chance to make decisions as well. For Tanya Allen, so diversity is not about counting the people. Inclusion is about making those people count. We've talked about inclusion and how we're kind of graduating this term from inclusion to diversity inclusion to D&I. We've many people working in this. In the late 90s, D&I was the hot new topic, and then, let's make it equity, diversity, and inclusion. So now it's EDI, and, that's the hot new thing in the early 2000s. And now it really comes down to justice, return of the Jedi. We need justice. We'll have equity, diversity, and inclusion to make this really a new society that we're all desiring and that will be responsive to many of our needs, right? The disparities just in the architectural realm. Right now, women make up 50%, maybe 51% of our U.S. population, but only 18% of the licensed architects. When we look at African Americans, which are roughly about 13.2% of the U.S. population, right now they're only 2% of licensed architects, and that percentage has not changed in at least 30 years. I entered architecture school in 1991, and the percentage of licensed architects that are African American was 1.9%. I remember hanging that on a piece of paper above my drafting table for 4 years, and now it's at a robust 2%, which is something that we are aggressively endeavoring to change. And so what's interesting, in 1968, Whitney Young gave a speech, one of the keynote speeches at the American Institute of Architects, essentially alluding to the fact that if you really want to make an equitable society and build better communities, then you must embrace diversity, and you must be able to better respond to social equity in those communities that you serve. He said that in 1968. As a result of that, and as a result of not much change since then, in 1971, 12 African-American architects met amongst themselves and said, AIA has no longer been responding to everything that we need to do, not only as professionals, but also in our communities. We need to find an opportunity to reflect and also effect change in our communities, but also foster excellence amongst our students. And as a result, the National Organization of Minority Architects was created with the mission to champion diversity within the design profession by promoting excellence, community engagement, and professional development of our members. To date, we now have over 30 professional chapters, and over 80 schools have chapters on campus. We have, as of the end of last year, a little over close to 1,400 paid members with over 600 student members. And we were rapidly eclipsing those numbers this year. We had nearly 1,000 paid members at the end of February of 2020. And then this, Auntie Rona decided to come by and put a halt on everything. So the COVID has challenged us all, but we are still fighting through to make sure our members and our numbers are rising. And so we have a number of initiatives that we're going to go through, and I'm going to breeze through because I want us to be able to have more time for conversation. But the Diversity by Design has several initiatives that we are forwarding, which are heralded by our president, Kimberly Dowdell, a very good friend of mine, and some of you have met, which was All In for NOMA 2020, which has the acronym ALL, which stands for Access, Leadership, and Legacy. But these are not only initiatives that we are profiting and using for NOMA itself, but also for the communities that we serve. We believe that we must leverage NOMA to create opportunities for everyone to access the profession of architecture, with a special focus on those groups who are least represented in this field. We want to see leadership, not only in our communities, but also in the discipline, and look at legacy, not only showing the rich history of how designers and architects of color have played in this country, but also ensuring that we have a pipeline that leads to further success. We have several projects that are pushing forward on that pipeline, which is our project pipeline, which is looking at increasing access to architecture to young people. We have a student competition. We have a fellowship for gentlemen and ladies that are going to do more in architecture. And then we also have a leadership programming, and we are forwarding more with our legacy programming, which is looking at the work that is being done by architects across the country. I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about that legacy, but also saying how we're going to help create jobs. When you're able to create jobs that we've been trained for, if you have some power, then your job is to empower somebody else. And that's something that we adhere to and promote tremendously through the National Organization of Minority Architects. Moving forward, we have a diversity challenge. We partnered with the Large Firm Roundtable with AIA, which is a representative of the 50 largest architecture firms in the country, which represent 85% of billable hours in architecture are by 50 firms in this country, and said we want to ensure that there are a pipeline of students of color or professionals of color into these firms and into leadership, not just being employed. And AIA and these firms have agreed to it. And also, our 2030 challenge is that within the next 10 years, we want to double the percentage of African-American architects that are licensed in this country. Incredibly aggressive, But we said it's enough is enough to have architects of color labor at 2% of our population for far too long. They have agreed with that, and we are rushing forward with that diversity challenge. Additionally, one of the things we've been using and promoting tremendously over the last several years has been our project pipeline, where we expose young people to architecture. The primary reason I got involved in architecture was because I met a Black architect in 1984 when I was 10 years old. And that's what got me interested in architecture. I grew up in the projects. I grew up in New York City Housing Authority. Anybody that knows New York knows the Housing Authority is challenging at best. And I grew up in East New York, Brooklyn, before it was gentrified Brooklyn. And so I know I am those people that we talk about. There is success there. And so we know when we're exposing our young people that we can get them engaged. I'm going to wrap this up very quickly because I know Kimberly's going to raise her hand at me. But one of the things we're going to talk about and we want to emphasize is the great words of James Baldwin: to be a hero in this country is to be relatively conscious, is to be in a rage almost all the time. But we're going to channel that rage. We're going to channel it to productivity. I want to thank everyone that's part of this. And I want you to know that I will be here for questions, and I am here for it all. Thank you, guys.
I feel like Showtime at the Apollo with my ringer here, but you were right on point, Antoine. And just so we can get through to the end, we have some questions in here about the pipeline from community college on. So there are folks that want to connect with NOMA, but the question that whether we bring forth this conversation about what is that moment? We've been long time recognizing each other for the last 10 years, but what would the challenge be for NOMA to USGBC when we're thinking about building scale, building capacity, leveraging, and really making sure that we're co-creating this space? So think about this, and whether it's in the conversations in the working groups or we can get back to that. That is a message that I want you to put on recording for USGBC. With that, I want to bring forward one of the historic environmentalists, environmental justice leaders that all the way back when we talked about the call to answer in 2005 for the council, Dianne Dillon Ridgely, sitting on the board of Interface, one of our founding member product manufacturers, want to bring you forward to kind of, you already started that historic context for what the future looks like. I'm going to let you take it away, Dianne.
Thank you. I'm going to try and get through sitting here. The conversations today and yesterday have been so rich. I'm constantly adding more and more notes. So I'm going to try and get through everything. But first I want to say, just building on Antoine, he should know one of my cousins was Verdner Woodson Tandy, who at Cornell University in 1906 became the first licensed architect in New York State. And my father's brother, Moselle August Dillon, was represented by Thurgood Marshall to be admitted to the University of Oklahoma, and 1948 got a letter denying him admission, and ultimately all of those led up to the Brown v. Board decision. So since Kimberly has introduced how old I am, or that I'm old and that I think historic, no, I'm not, I'm fine with it. It really is important for us to understand that we are bringing forward this legacy. And I always say I stand in this world as a daughter and a mother. And I always try and keep in mind those who came before and how much they put on the line and their commitment to doing this. So it's important that we recognize that we are not where we want to be, but we also need to take a moment and recognize the elders and those who invested everything that they had, and many of whom passed away and died or were taken from us because they were doing this. And I don't want to get too emotional on that because it's very easy for it to do. The second thing I want to say is I hope people will truly think of today's presentations as a continuum. I mean, Majora said some things that I was about to say, and then I mean, each of us has made pieces that each of us could or have at some previous point said. Denise was saying things that I've been talking about for a long time in terms of reaching and exceeding our natural sink capacity. So whether we come from these different disciplines, we are now at a point in the moment where we can put all of that together. Okay, now I got some corrections to make. I want to thank Heather because she thought I was going to be giving my presentation today from the cab of a U-Haul truck on Interstate 88. But it rained and there was so much flooding. I'm in Iowa, for those of you who don't know, that I actually postponed the departure. So as soon as I finish, I'm going to be hitting the highway. I want to thank Ryan. I want to thank George and Kimberly in particular, also Sarah from yesterday's Heartkeepers. We've been sort of a little team and band of people from when I did my first presentation. And I always make this point because I want people to understand how long this commitment has been with USGBC, how deep it has been, and how challenging it has been. Because in 2005, Karan Govan from India, the architect from India, and I were the first two people of color to be master speakers and to be lifted up to that perspective. So you can see when you look at any program and agenda now that USGC puts out, how far we have come from 2005. I need to disclaim this, I am not on the board of Interface anymore. I was on the board for 17 years. Interface is a very delightfully sticky connection. It was huge in my life, but I'm actually the executive director of the Women's Network for a Sustainable Future. I'm also on the board of VEIC, the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation. I'm on the board of CL, the Center for International Environmental Law, and I was the first person of color to chair their board and the first woman to chair their board. And there's some others, like 23 U.S. delegations, and I was on Clinton's Council of Sustainable Development, which I only mentioned because 30 years ago, we were focusing as a nation on what we needed to do in terms of sustainability, which then we only called it sustainable development. And as Marge said earlier, we got through the habit of whenever we were at the time bringing up our greenness, people said, oh, it's too expensive. Oh, I can't do this, etc. Well, this is we need to bring that same, I'm just going to say it, kick-ass mentality to not accepting all those excuses to where we are now at this moment in terms of finally getting institutionally infrastructure complete with equity and equality and justice in the same way that we have with all of these other parts. Now, I've got this list, so I'm going to keep going down the list. So, okay. We need to take inventory, as I said, and because we are justifiably impatient, but we also have to recognize that we have moved. I want to underscore what all of us have said. What we need to leave behind, bring with us, is power. All of this ultimately is about power. And that's why I brought up the aspect of when you have these advisory boards and the other things. That's great. But if they do not have veto power, and therefore they don't have that capacity to have the impact on wealth creation, because it is about creating the wealth that has made the difference. So, okay, let's see, got through that. We are focused on democratizing capital and democratizing our commons. We have exceeded the natural sink capacity of our natural systems. And for anyone who hasn't read it or followed, Laurie Garrett, about 10 years ago, did the Coming Environmental Plague. We will see as we continue to challenge climate justice that all of these pieces are connected and intertwined. I want to say, when people say to me, oh, but it costs more, I want to make very, very clear, it has always cost. It's just who pays and how they pay. Too often, people in what we sometimes call sacrifice zones in communities have paid with their health, with their life. We certainly paid with not having livelihoods. They've been paid by our bodies have become repositories of toxins and substances that people didn't want in some communities, but they said, well, it's okay to put it in this community. Well, that day is over too. We have to create new balance sheets that have total cost accounting. Let's see. Okay, getting down the list. We've dismantled these patterns. I want to bring up another name that has been very important to me and a mentor to me, Hazel Henderson. 30 or 40 years ago, Hazel Henderson started talking about the love economy. I want people to understand how brave she had to be to stand her ground, because all of the, and I say euphemistically, the big boys would roll their eyes when she started talking about the love economy. But if you think about it, that's exactly what we're talking about with justice. Whether we talk about how we figure out ways in which I don't just love my children, Karima and Dasal, but I love all children. And I want them to have, they're very grown now, but I want them to have, and have always wanted to have, all of the children to be able to have the kind of life and capacity to fully develop themselves that doesn't exist when people are confronted and routinely faced with all of these negative capacities. I want us to also think about how we need to attack changing the tax structures, because right now, the way tax structures, property taxes in particular, are set up, there are benefits that go to the ownership, but as people continue to live in multifamily dwellings and the amount of ownership in terms of where people live continues to reduce, those patterns of how they were set up continue, but they become disincentives to getting us to have better buy-in and quicker buy-in. Somebody earlier today, I couldn't catch the name because these pieces flashed rather quickly. I'm in Iowa, and someone said, what about rural America and rural communities? Well, much of the work that I've done internationally over the years with the Global Water Partnership or internationally has been focused on the rural communities. And while obviously in about 10 years ago, we flipped the percentage of people who lived in rural communities to urban communities, and we are continuing to urbanize, especially in the southern hemisphere. When you get São Paulo's and 10 of the largest cities will all be in the southern hemisphere before the end of this decade. We still have large numbers of people who live in financially and, I don't want to say intellectually, but policy abandoned rural communities. So that's another piece that, particularly as we're looking going forward with equity and justice, we need to put rural communities on that, indigenous communities. You know, we look at COVID and we were talking about what the disproportionate impact is. We haven't even begun to address in reality and at the front levels what the history is in this nation of impact to Native peoples. One of the things that's happened, and maybe I'll just sort of conclude with that for now. One of the things that I think has happened in the last 5 to 7 years, when we start a conference, when we start, we talk about who has lived in this space, who has lived on this land, who lived here 1,000 years ago, who lived here 10,000 years ago. I think when we want to talk about history, we need to recognize that we didn't just show up yesterday and things started. There is a continuum, and we have inherited its legacy, rich, poor, good, bad, whatever. And I think that habit, that custom of honoring whose land is this, that should be, I can hear that. Whose land is this? And how are we here? And how did we get here? If we bring all of that mindset together, that makes it positions us far better to be able to embrace what my grandmothers used to talk about. You owe for the time you take up and the space you occupy on the planet. We will do this. Thank you, Kimberly, for asking me to be part of this. You know that I have been carrying this in my heart and in my throat for so long. So to have this Equity Summit, there was a tornado, in my neighborhood 2 days ago. Yesterday was flash flooding. Despite all of that, I had to be able to be here to be part of this because it has taken us so long to get to this moment. We are the richer for it, and I am excited, enthused, and encouraged by the people who were born in this century who are now on the team for this, because we need to think of this as a multi-general team. It is a continuum. Thank you so much, and I hope I was able to bring up a few points for people to consider.
Outstanding. I'm sitting here looking at the conference chat. I'm looking at the side staff chat, and they're just like, we have got to get this information out. The conversations are so robust and abundant. I want to say, this is what climate change looks like, pandemics, of the movement. You are my mentor, so how could we even think about having this without giving you a moment? And this is one of a series that Mahesh wants to do, so you'll be back. But I had to point out one of our TBCI partners, ISSP, went crazy in the chat when you talked about Hazel Henderson and her speaking about the love economy. She is one of the ISSP Hall of Famers. So as always, you bring us so intricately together. Thank you. And with that, I want to bring to the stage someone, to our virtual stage, someone that literally exploded our Greenville Communities and Affordable Housing Summit in Boston. And coming to the stage in her former position as Chief Resilience Officer and introducing for us the lens of racial equity in the resilience conversation. You are alive and well in this pandemic space and responding for communities of color in the New England community. Take it away, Dr. Atyia.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. I really appreciate it. I am in a place right now feeling all kinds of emotions, and so I'm just being transparent about that. In addition to the work that we do at All Aces Inc., a lot of the work we do at All Aces Inc. is really about helping organizations better understand what racism is, how it's part of a larger system of oppression, how those traits and characteristics of oppression show up in organizations, and most importantly, how to swim upstream when problems surface so that we can actually address them in meaningful ways. The other half of the work that I've been doing is really on the ground in communities in Boston. My nonprofit is one of the two backbone organizations for the Black Boston COVID-19 Coalition. And so I'm feeling very overwhelmed right now with the pain and suffering in the community, and also very overwhelmed by the joy and action in the ways that people have translated all of these negative experiences and the lack of resources and the narrative even about communities into action that is really about doing the things that we can with what we have, which is a segue into where I'm going today, which is this intersection of equity and resilience. A lot of times we talk about resilience as bouncing back and returning to normal. And I think many of us here understand that that is actually not an effective strategy. If we're committed to the values of sustainability and resilience, what we really have to embed into it is the opportunities for transformation. There's a whole area of transformational resilience at the individual level, at the community level, that really helps to reframe so that we're not just bouncing back, that we're bouncing forward, that we're actually using these opportunities to really, again, swim upstream to see where the root causes of the problems of our communities and in our structures and systems are. A lot of times we talk about equity, and I know there's a whole, you can have a whole nerdy debate. We could have a whole nerdy debate. I am a nerd. I own and love that as part of my identity, about kind of words we choose. I use equity, and I include lots of things in there. And one of the things I've learned in doing this work is that the same work that we need to do to reach our full potential as human beings and in our organizations is the same work we need to do to advance racial equity and advance equity in general. Here's what I mean by that. Racism and oppression in general sits on top of a very complicated set of human laws, right? And they work in simple times. They don't work that well with complexity. And so it's the complexity that we struggle with. The fact that we can have both shared humanity and different experiences and different cultures and different upbringings, that both of those can exist and both of those can be true. We don't have to pick. the other piece is this idea that I mentioned earlier of humility. How do we show up in spaces with humility? And part of it is owning that when we normally show up in spaces, we've been socialized to believe that we're supposed to show up a certain way. So if you're a professional, right, we're supposed to show up, know the answers, we're supposed to take control of the room, we're supposed to do all of these things that further reinforce oppression, but no one ever frames it that way. That's just, what it means to be a professional and be normal, what it means to be a leader. And all of those things are part of the qualities of oppression that are tricky, right? Because people of color are disproportionately bearing the burden of the problems of our society, the problems with our systems, the problems with our structures. That's where the racism piece comes in. Because of our inability to see the shared humanity and the different experiences, it makes it harder for folks to see how the same fissures and problems in our systems and our structures and our organizations are harmful to white people too. So if there's an organization that people of color don't want to be at, then you can pretty much guess the people who were there probably don't want to be there either. There are kinds of environments where there's a lot of exploitation, there's a lot of exclusion, there's a sense of reinforcing powerlessness, there's no agency, there's a disproportionate burden of the problems of the organization, again, on people who are underestimated or part of underestimated groups. And there's a sense of objectivity that there's only one way to do everything. There's only one way to be. And if you don't fit into the neat little boxes that have been created, there's something wrong with you. And so I bring that up because as we talk about the work that we have to do in communities, in order to do that work well, we also have to be doing that work on ourselves and in our organizations. It's hard to practice equity outside when we haven't taken care of what we need to do inside our organizations. If we live in organizations that are reinforcing these oppressive qualities that are conductors of oppression, then it is really hard to expect the same people from that organization to go out into the world and advance equity. So I challenge us to make sure that as we're doing this work, that we are taking hold of our agency, that all of us have agency in this work, that it's not any one person's job because they look a certain way. All people of color and all marginalized groups or underestimated groups do not have a PhD in oppression and should not be expected to kind of always fill the roles that are supposed to be meant to do D&I work or DEI work or EDI work or JEDI work or whatever language you want to use. But that if we're doing it well in our organizations, we're embedding this across all the work that we're doing, the entire organizational system, from the way we talk about our strategic direction, our mission, vision, values, through to how we communicate with each other, up, down, across, all the way to how we make decisions in our organizations, to the way that the resources get distributed because of those decisions and who gets access to what. So in terms of making this practical, in terms of us being really committed to these things, again, as I mentioned earlier, we have to be able to look into that mirror as organizations. And I will not lie to you, it is not easy work. There's no formula, there's no magic equation. It takes us putting in the work, doing the hard work of learning about who we are, why we are, who we want to be, and whether or not there's a disconnect and how we close that gap. And that goes for individuals, and that goes for organizations and larger communities. And so where I'll land with this is this session, this part of the conference opened up, or summit opened up with a song that I struggled with, because the beauty of the voices singing it was amazing, right? And the message of the song, the words, the refrain that keeps repeating over and over again is kind of waiting on the world to change, right? And we can't do that. We cannot do that. We actually have to, today, there are things that we can be doing, starting with ourselves, stepping up our racial equity literacy, stepping up our equity literacy, being able to be in spaces with other people and being able to manage the thoughts happening in our minds so that we can be present in moments that matter, so that we can really hear each other, not just listen to the words people are saying, but see the deeper meaning in what people are communicating, especially in communities, especially since everyone doesn't have all of the fancy language to communicate in ways that we want them to, that we're able to still hear the value and the meaning that they are offering, the wisdom that they are offering to us. And so one of my favorite quotes is, most people don't recognize opportunity because it comes disguised as hard work. And so I say the opportunity that we have here is to do the hard work it takes to really take advantage of the true moment in time that we're in, to step up our game in terms of our own learning, our own growth, our human development, as well as our organizational development. So thank you very much for having me, and I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. Personal agency. And how do we activate immediately? It's one of the things that our CEO Mahesh said is figuring out what are the tangible things that we can run with Monday. So thank you for bringing that call to action. That'll be recorded. The data is here for our attendees. We did have a bit of a misrepresentation of Dr. Martin's organization and her work. We have edited that in the chat. So for folks that want to continue to reference and engage and partner with her, it will be available in our closing notes and information as well as the chat. I do want to say Dr. Martin will have to step away for the action working groups. So I do want to make this moment to encourage attendees and folks. And we've gotten that challenge on record that she left with us. Thank you, Dr. Martin. And we are heading to the end of challenge round 1 with a significant voice who, this is our first equity summit, but after the 2005 conference that Greenfield held that really elevated the conversations of diversity, equity, and inclusion for the council, which then led to us establishing guiding principles and values, Jerome Ringo came to the table for our annual membership meeting to really drive a visual and a roadmap around accountability for what should we do next. Since that time, he has definitely broadened his scope of engagement and working in our space. And I want to hand this over to him to be our last challenger for round 1. And then we'll be stepping for a break and then coming back for round 2. Take it away, Jerome. And thank you.
A chance to participate in this wonderful event. The Green Building Council, of course, I have been affiliated and associated with you guys for some time. And back in those days, I was the chairman of the National Wildlife Federation, the 5 million member-supported organization, which was the largest member-supported conservation organization in the United States. And I was the first African-American to head a major conservation in the conservation movement history. Not long after that, I took over the Apollo Alliance, which was a coalition on clean energy, promoting green jobs as an economic stimulant. And we built that coalition to somewhere around 19 million members, which was clearly the largest coalition on clean energy ever. I also continued lecturing. I divided the 4 years of lecturing at Yale University at the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and at the Bren School of the Environment at University of California, Santa Barbara. Worked very, very close with in the climate negotiations, was part of the delegation in Rio, first climate talks, and also Kyoto, and have been a part of those talks throughout the years, spokesperson for non-governmental organizations. throughout all the way up to Madrid last year. And since that time, I have really focused on how do we turn advocacy into action. For many years, I was involved in the advocacy movement, which we all are, to promote changes in policy and be able to drive the things that will change the world and give those that have been disproportionately impacted an equal shot. I wanted to do something that I consider to be more tangible, especially in the climate change space globally. Of course, I still live in Louisiana, where I'm speaking to you from my home in Louisiana, where I live on the coast of Louisiana, just about 40 minutes from the coast. Still victims or have been victims of hurricanes like Katrina and Gustav, Ike, Wilma, Rita, and still that disproportionate impact caused the impacts on our community in particular to be far greater. That still exists today. We're still facing the same environmental justice challenges with the location of facilities disproportionately in our communities. Oil and gas is still king in Louisiana, and unfortunately, our community lives in closest proximity to those facilities. So the battle goes on. But my focus shifted somewhat to not just a domestic challenge, but looking at the challenges globally around the world. And I formed a company, a partner and I formed a company called Zoetic, Zoetic, which means pertaining to life. The idea of Zoetic was to bring together a massive group of technologies, best-in-class technologies, that could meet the globe's greatest needs. And as I looked at what does the world need the most, especially in the developing world, and that was clean water was a top priority, and electricity, recognizing that 850 million people did not have access to electricity, and 1.2 billion people, even at this very moment, can't get a clean glass of water. So I wanted to amass a portfolio of technologies that I could offer to companies and communities in the States as well as throughout the world that could sort of meet the greatest demands while at the same time being affordable and environmentally friendly to help reduce that disproportionate impact. So my focus primarily were the developing countries. I ended up offering projects in Africa around clean water. To date, I've made about 78 trips to Africa in the last 4 years, and during that time, I was named the Goodwill Ambassador for Trade and Investment by the Pan-African Parliament and the African Union. That whole focus is to promote trade and investment from the West into Africa, especially in the energy space and promoting clean water. In that portfolio of best-in-class technologies, I was able to narrow it down to a technology that I consider to be the flagship of my company, and that was efficiency. Yeah, sure, there are wind turbine technologies, there are solar technologies, and all those are great to be able to offer a electricity and energy at a reduced cost. We even engaged in hydro technologies where we were putting floating units in rivers downstream from dams and using the flow of the water to turn turbines in the units and generate electricity at a very cheap rate. But what we found was a technology that was sort of on the coattail of the 2012 decision in Montreal that Freon in air conditioning should be banned because Freon R22s are not friendly to the environment. And of course, all of us that have cooling, especially in places like Louisiana or in sub-Saharan Africa, must have cooling. And so, and that's either in cooling or in refrigeration to preserve food. Much of the food that is produced here in the United States and even in Africa spoils. 66% of the food that is grown in Africa spoils because there's no adequate refrigeration. So how do we provide a product within those communities that is low cost that will meet those needs. So we now have engaged a technology that we're taking around the world called All Temp, and it is a replacement for Freon. The wonderful thing about it is that it meets the demands of Montreal, but because of the chemical makeup of our refrigerant, it has a cost savings in it. It costs less money to cool your home or your building or your refrigeration unit. Thus, it creates a cost savings. Money that is saved that can be reapplied in other areas where there's great demand. Right now, and several months ago, I addressed the African Union and 55 heads of state over there in Niger. And the idea of being able to use our refrigerant in all of their government buildings, thus reducing their energy costs by about 40%. That frees up money that can be used to deal with issues like COVID-19, or deal with equity issues, or deal with a better education, or providing clean water. The whole idea is that we provide an avenue of generating more money without there having to be any or very little investment up front. The return for us is in the cost savings. If we bring our refrigerant into government buildings in Africa and the cost of electricity drops by 40%, whatever the cost savings is, and the cost savings could be hundreds of millions of dollars a year based on the number of units that we install our product in, we simply will negotiate a part of the cost savings to come back into our company, which we can reinvest into other projects, and the remainder of the cost savings will go into the hands of the country or the company that utilizes our product. And it's literally creating money that can be regenerated or reused into other valuable and meaningful projects. So this seems to be working well. It's also working here in the United States. We're in talks right now with Carnival Cruise Lines. We are now currently cooling the data center for Southwest Airlines at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. We are cooling Harry Potter Village at Universal Studios in Florida. We are cooling a number of the precincts at the New York City Police Department. We're in Costco's. We're in Atyia. We are in Hilton Hotels. We're in W Hotels. And we are the only company in the world who has a refrigerant that will save you money at the level that we offer savings. No one can touch us, nowhere in the world. And that's a great place to be right now. So what's most important to me is not so much about the benefits to the company, but the benefits to the customer, the benefits to the people that don't have clean water, that don't have electricity, that may not have viable means to deal with COVID-19 or equity within their communities. It's an opportunity that we can genuinely assist in leveling the playing field for those that have been set aside or have been disproportionately impacted. It works, and we're excited about it. We're also talking to historically Black colleges in the United States who are facing many financial challenges, and we're already about to do a project at Southern University in Baton Rouge. We're at Texas Southern University in Houston. We're speaking to in North Carolina, and we're going to bring this product and make a difference in the lives of those of us who are disproportionately. Thank you for the opportunity.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jerome. And Kimberly's chime went off right as you were wrapping up. Thanks to all of our panelists. Jerome, before we wrap up and move into break, just quickly, what is your challenge for us at USGBC? You had one thing to tell us, to challenge us.
Well, I think that your initiative that you have in America, of course, has to be spread throughout the world. There are different standards, of course, as you go from nation to nation. But one thing in Africa, in 2018, Africa signed what's called the Continental Free Trade Agreement. This is the first agreement of its kind that unifies the continent of Africa as one economy. I think there's a role for the Green Building Council to play in creating standards for new buildings that includes efficiency, that can really make a difference in the lives of Africans and the economy of Africa going forward.
Fantastic. And in the words of our president and CEO, Mahesh, that's an action item for our international team. So thank you for closing us out with that global perspective.